welcome Professor Dr. Brigitte Geißel from the University of Frankfurt. We're very happy that you join us tonight because your ideas and your book and the innovational thinking on democratic thinking and really is a good way to start new thinking, which is something that we would like to do in our project. So we are very looking forward to the ideas and to the lecture that you have prepared for us tonight. Just a few words again on you. Professor Geißel is a professor of political science and political sociology and head of the Democratic Innovations Research Center at the Goethe University in Frankfurt. And she has taught and conducted research at various universities, institutions, including Harvard University. And has received several awards of her research, including a Democratic Fellowship from Harvard University, Marie Curie Fellowship, and so on. So I think we have someone here tonight with very expertise, and we're looking forward to the lecture tonight. And with this, I would like to give the floor to you, to your presentation. Welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much for the nice welcome. Yes, I'm very happy to be here. I hope this works. It's really a pleasure. And I'm very, very impressed by all these translators, of course, and all these translating activities. It's really great. Yes, I'm looking forward to the lecture, and I'm also looking forward to the discussion because it's always interesting for me to discuss with people from different contexts. So please, if you have a question or a comment or a critique, do not hesitate to write it into the chat or to tell me after the lecture. It will be really interesting. I hope you can see my screen. Is that okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Yes, the topic of my lecture is Democracy as Self-Government, Democratic Innovations by and with Citizens. And it's based on my book, The Future of Self-Governing Driving Democracies. It's also in German. It's both are online, both are open access, so you can read them. So what is the whole thing about? We all know that representative democracy is in crisis, and I will show a couple of slides in a couple of minutes, and that will show this. So the question is how to proceed. What can we do to change or to help shaping the future of democracy? What I think, and it's very nice that you mentioned it, Marina, that we need new ideas and visions. As Oscar Wilde has said, a map of the world that does not include utopia is not worth even glancing at it. Progress is the realization of utopia. And the whole development of democracy is the realization of utopia. It was an utopia to have democracy 300 years ago. So progress always starts with new ideas, and then they materialize, they become real. What is the outline of my talk? First, as promised, I will give some slides about democracy in crisis. What does it mean? There are more slides, there are more indicators, more signs of crisis, but I just, limited to a few. Okay, then I will talk about what I think, for me as a political scientist or for social science in general, what should we do to help citizens to govern themselves? And I will talk about this idea that paternalistic advices, that the idea that we as political scientists or politicians or experts know what is right. No, I think that's not true. I think the task is, and the idea is that I want to put forward that we should support citizens to govern themselves, to give them ideas, to invite them to think about what would be the right way of governing ourselves. Then I will talk about the core concept, democracy as self-governing, how I define it. I bring some normative and some empirical arguments. So all this, why do I think that democracy as self-governing is a good thing? Then I talk about a few experiences, but we have already experienced in the political world on self-governing, and then finally the outlook. Democracy in crisis. This is just a slide provided by an index that looks at the quality of democracy, Bertelsmann Stiftung, they say it's a decline of quality of democracies in EU and OECD countries. You see here a couple of different, what we call like indicators or factors or variables. It's electoral process, rule of law, access to information, so media pluralism, media freedom, civil rights and political liberties. And you see from 2011 to 2018, that was unfortunately the last year, but it's going down since then. So there is, quality of democracy seems to be declining in a lot of different aspects. Another slide that shows is the share of people in the different countries that say that their political system needs reform. Normally, we think in a representative system, we all live in representative democracies. The point is that we choose our representatives, and then when we choose the right representatives, then uh, the representative democracy will work. But as you can see, in many countries, people say that the selection of representatives of our politicians is no longer sufficient. We need, or they want their political system to be transformed. They want another political system. And you see here the answer need to be completely transformed, political system needs major changes, needs minor changes, or doesn't need to be changed at all. For example, in Spain, a vast majority says that the political system itself needs to be completely reformed or needs really big changes. We have here all the countries, also in Germany, it's a majority that says needs to be transformed, minor or major transformation. Just countries like New Zealand and also Switzerland, which is not on the slide, or Canada, are pretty much satisfied with their country, with the system, with their political system. So you see, there seems to be a crisis that cannot be solved by new politicians. But it's this feeling of many people that the political system itself does no longer serve the interests and the needs of the citizens. And that is kind of the starting point of my whole endeavor. Um, like as a political scientist, we discussed a lot what can we do to improve democracy? And there are a lot of advices for how to improve democracy, what we can do. But, and I will give you a couple of examples in a minute. My problem with all these advices is that they mostly advocate the author's favorite model or practice as supposedly better options. They insinuate, or they say, my idea is the best idea, and we all should do this. And if every community has this change or works with these kinds of innovations, then it will work. And they do not take into account that citizens and communities have very different preferences, have very different resources, and also very different needs. As you could already see on the slide before, on this one, in Spain, the requirement or the need or the demand for a new democracy or for another political system is much bigger than in New Zealand. So you see, in different communities in different countries, there are different needs, there are different ideas about what should be changed. Now, a couple of examples, what are discussed, what could be new models or new ideas as potential redeemers or as savers for democracy. We have all these debates about open democracy with what we call autocratic alternatives. It's an idea that is very widespread, or that randomly selected citizens should be more involved in political decision making, or what London Moore called mass leadership, by representing and being represented in turn. It's an idea that we don't have elected, or not only elected representatives, but also randomly selected representatives. But the idea behind it that then, we have a more we would have a legislative body, a parliament that mirrors society, half women, half men, and so on and so on. Another idea put forward by Mansbridge, professor from Harvard, that we need more deliberative systems with multiple forms of communication, mini publics, participatory budgeting, all kinds of these things with knots, and then that everything together would work and make democracy better. Lafont talks about what she says, democracy without shortcuts. We need a long and participatory road. And Tormi says we have to create impetus, resonance, glamour, turbulence, act in swarms. We need crowd mobilization, create resonance, diffuse power. So it's an idea to get rid of parliaments and have a kind of decision-making or political will formation and decision-making procedure that is more participatory, inclusive, and takes into account that a lot of different people are involved, should be involved. So these are some ideas, some models these political scientists or experts put forward, but maybe they do not really work. Some citizens or communities, they might not want any deliberative system or this idea of what it's called autocratic alternatives. So this idea that randomly selected people get into power, or what Tormi called glamour and turbulence. So this more chaotic idea of decision making. We also know a lot of other practices that are put forward, have been put forward recently, which could potentially are expected to save representative democracy. For example, social movements, protest groups, what we call mini publics and other so-called deliberative practices. These are all this kind of citizens' assemblies which come together and discuss about political issues and then bring recommendations forward to the politicians. They are very famous recently, for example, in Germany, in many other countries. You have this experiences with this kind of citizens' assemblies. But also, of course, referendums, popular votes, this idea that direct democracy, so citizens decide themselves about political issues, not only about the political leaders, but also about policies, about topics, is supposedly could save democracy. We have all these debates about participatory budgeting, which has been very famous in the last like decades. I think also many countries of those who are here represented have some experience with participatory budgeting. The idea of liquid democracy, vote delegation. So liquid democracy is all this idea that we need online tools, that we use online communication, and the idea is that we do not give our vote for a certain party or a certain candidate, but we give our vote, we split the vote for certain areas and fields. For example, I give my vote for everything that is connected with policy, with social policies to one person or one party, and my vote for topics that are connected to internal politics or external politics to another, or environmental politics to another party or candidate. So it's a split of the votes. It's a very innovative idea, this vote delegation. This is another thing that is discussed very lively in recent years. This idea of randomly selected parliaments, which I already mentioned before, that we do not select parties, elect parties or elect candidates, that it's randomly selected, a parliament that is randomly selected of ordinary citizens, or something that is called multi-body sortition. Again, this is an idea that we have different kinds of assemblies that are randomly selected, and they then kind of together make political decisions. Everyday activities, as for example, the playful protest by the knitting nanas against gas. It's something Hendricks and C.N. Erkan have put forward. They say we need more of these, more close to life activities, these playful activities like these nanas, these women knitting in front of the parliament to protest against new gas exploitation procedures. There's also an idea that we need more experts, technocrats, and the informed to make decisions. So what we call expertocracy, this idea that citizens should not have so much say, but experts should be more involved in decision making. And there are more things, for example, recall, which is not on this list. Recall is an idea that we can the citizens can get rid of politicians, of representatives before the end of their electoral term. So when after 1 or 2 or 3 years, citizens realize that they don't want these politicians anymore, then they can recall him and ask him to step down, which, for example, we have in Germany for mayors. So it's another practice that could be used. Again, these are all wonderful ideas, but I think some citizens or communities might not want, for example, mini publics or this idea of citizens' assemblies or randomly selected parliaments or referendums or whatever. Um, I think what we should do, or what I think is more important, to support citizens to govern themselves. There are no one-size-fits-all suggestions. For example, or I give some examples later on. I think there is no predetermined model or practice as supposedly the best way of governing every and all communities. And we should take into account what citizens and communities want and need. Maybe yeah, there will be more examples later on. Um, Instead of advertising a certain model, for example, saying we all now need randomly selected parliaments, or we all now need citizens' assemblies, or we all now need referendums and popular votes and direct democracy, I think we should go back to this roots of this meaning of democracy as self-governing by, with, and for the people, which is a rephrase of Lincoln's famous saying. I think activating Mansbridge's notion that political science is about helping citizens to govern themselves. I claim that it's the task to support them, citizens and communities, in their search to find the best way for self-governing. So to start or inspire a discussion among citizens in communities. What do we want? How do we want to be governed? It's to get away from this idea, like to complain about corrupt politicians and the bad system and so on and so on, and get more into a positive idea and into a positive future-oriented, thinking about what would be the right way of governing in our community, in our society, what would fit to us, what would be the best model, what would be the best practices for us to govern ourselves if we are not satisfied with the way it is. Um, yeah, now I'm coming to democracy as self-governing, which is like the core of my thinking. What does it mean? It means that citizens and communities deliberate, they discuss, they think about, and then they decide about the kind of democracy they want to live in, which includes the tenets, which are the goals, the practices, the procedures, and then adapted continuously. What do I mean when I say it includes the tenets, the goals? It includes, for example, the thinking about how much political equality or social equality do we want? Do we want a society that is pretty equal, or is it okay to have a society that is unequal? So that would be an overarching goal that we want to achieve with our society. The practices refers to, do we just want elections? Are elections of representatives enough? Or do we want to add other forms and formats of participation, for example, citizens' assemblies or participatory budgeting or referendums? And how should the procedures look like? So this is a very complex thinking about how we want to govern ourselves. This concept of this idea of self-governing says that you should start with participatory constitution building. In most countries, also in Germany, the constitution building process was purely made by experts. Citizens were not involved in the constitution building. They were not asked how the constitution should look like. They were not asked what is the goal of our society. How should procedures of political decision making look like? So, but I think we should start with a process of participatory constitution building, and then it's an ongoing process. So there are no institutions set up for eternity. But the idea is that communities, societies change, and also the constitution and the political setup has to change. There was the second, or was it the third US president 200 years ago. He was a strong proponent of this idea. He said each generation should build its own constitution. So every 20 or 25 years, the constitution must be reconsidered because societies change. He didn't win, so we have other kinds of constitutions, but the idea is to make constitutions more fitting to the society. Self-governing would give political authorship and ownership back to the citizens. Citizens and communities are the creators, the authors, and the owners of their community. They would feel that the democracy is their community, their democracy, and not something that happens somewhere or is organized by someone somewhere. But it's this idea of self-ownership. Um, and now there are some examples, what I said before, that different communities might need very different kinds and formats and ways of governing themselves. You can imagine a community with very responsive, reliable, and honest politicians. They are perfectly fine with representative democracy. For example, in Finland, I realized that people are pretty satisfied with their politicians, which I found really interesting. So they trust their representatives. They do not consider any participatory practices beyond elections as necessary or just very few practices. They say our politicians really represent our interests and needs. So we are completely fine with this. We might have another community that is very heterogeneous, deeply divided, conflict prone, and a history of corrupt politicians. Such a community might prefer to combine several participatory practices in addition to elections. And they might say we need elections because it's impossible to have to live without a parliament that makes decisions. But in order to achieve more inclusive, which is called deliberation or discussion involvement, we need many other participatory formats and ways of putting input into the political system. We need mini publics, we need citizens' assemblies, we need direct democratic practices to ensure that decision making is in line with our interests and with our needs. So a very different community with very different context, very different background, which has to or thinks about the need or how they want to be governed in a very different way. You might have a third community with a very long-standing history of participatory practices, which have been had a long history of different kinds of participation, decision making. They might even get rid of elections, which is a little bit, I know this is a little bit provocative, but nevertheless, I just leave it here. They might implement a combination of randomly selected chamber of parliament, multi-issue referendums, vote delegation with liquid democracy, and so on and so on. So a mixture of different forms that make sure that a broad variety of citizens are included in the decision-making process. What are my arguments? Why do I think that democracies should be self-governing? I think that democracy is not something like a board game or a card game where the players just have to learn the rules described by game designers. Some politicians and scholars think of democracy that way, but it is not. Neither politicians nor scholars know what democracy is, and they can hardly judge whether citizens' ideas are right or wrong. I think democracy doesn't mean that people just learn and live according to rules prescribed by expert designers. I think it should be the other way around. Citizens are the sovereign. This is the definition of democracy. It's the rule of the people. And this rule should also apply to the design of democracy itself, the whole setup of democracy, which should meet the refined preferences of their sovereign. Of course, there's an exception. It's human rights and civil liberties. I always get this question, what if citizens do get rid of human rights and civil liberties? Then it's no longer a democracy. A democracy needs civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and so on and so on. Otherwise, it cannot be a democracy. So this is something that is not part of a discussion. And yeah, this kind of citizens or self-rule, self-governing might especially be important in polarized societies where politicians cannot come to terms. This is a specific story, for example, in Belgium. There are also a lot of empirical arguments why I think democracy should be more, or the setup of democracy, the design of democracies should be more concerned about the citizens who live in these democracies. Democracies are more stable. We know that when they are aligned with the democratic preferences of the citizens. So when the democratic processes are more uh, aligned in line with the citizens who live in this democracy. Democracies are more inclusive when the people are the authors of their own rights. They are more beneficial for ordinary people. For example, Samuels, who did a research on participatory inclusive processes of constitution building, and he said that constitutions that are built together with citizens in a participatory process tend to result in constitutional drafts or constitutions which provide rights to those groups which had not up to then gained political protection or recognition. One important example might be the Irish participatory constitution making process, where randomly selected citizens' assembly came together and they decided that first abortion should be liberated and same-sex marriage. So the abortion problem, as you might know, that Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, had very strong and strict abortion rules, and a lot of women died because there was no abortion. They tried to do it themselves, so it was really a mess. But the parliamentarians were, as in most countries, mostly older men who were not male politicians, who were not really interested in this topic. But when this citizens' assembly, randomly selected citizens' assembly came together, half women, half men, also young women, then this, what is said, this group, young women who could give birth in this age, they said we have to change this abortion right. We have to liberalize it so that women have more rights. And so they put this idea forward. There was a referendum, and at the end, the abortion rights became more liberal. So this group gained more protection. This group of young women gained more protection than they had protected by these mainly male parliamentarians. And I also think that democracy would be revitalized when citizens have the option, the possibility to have a say how they want to be governed. I think they will gain feelings of like efficacy, of democratic authorship, which could also increase their resilience to populism, polarization, and extremism. And all these narratives that construct this story of the corrupt elites versus the people will fall on unfertile grounds. So citizens will feel that their democracy is really their democracy, and there is no all these debates about the corrupt elites would not make sense when they have decided themselves of how to govern themselves. Just my question, am I too fast or is it okay? Just to get some feedback.
I think looks okay. Translators.
Okay. Because I cannot see them. I can only see you, Melina. Marina. Yeah. Okay. We have some experiences with participatory constitution building. For example, citizens elect the members of the assembly that drafted the constitution, for example, in Chile. Chile was a very interesting process, which at the end didn't work for different reasons. But Michel Bachelet, the former president of Chile, had really started a very participatory constitution building process in Chile, like from the bottom up with neighborhood meetings and all kinds of attempts to really make the constitution building very participatory. And a lot of ideas came up in these processes. For example, should the constitution include the right to have, or the right for environments, to have good environment, environmental protection, or the right for everybody to have a house or a living, a place where they could stay. accommodation or certain social securities and so on and so on. So there are a lot of debates about this kind of tenets or goals or what the society should provide came up during these very participatory processes. As I've said, at the end it didn't work out, but it was an interesting idea. Um, Another example is what I've already mentioned in Ireland, where randomly selected citizens uh, came together in a citizen assembly and recommended several constitutional amendments, which were then decided via a referendum. That worked very well in Ireland. In Iceland, there was a very intricate procedure that tried to ensure a so-called crowd-sourced constitutions, and this is on my next slide, which I can't go into details, but just to give you an idea, it started with a national forum with randomly selected citizens, with almost 1,000. A constitutional committee with experts provided a report, summarized all the ideas that were provided by the national forum. Then there was a constitutional council that was elected by the citizens of Iceland, but they were not politicians. So a couple of people stood up as candidates. I mean, it was really a very different crowd of people, not politicians. And then in a so-called iterative process, there was an online process where people could put in what they want in the new constitution. They could prioritize. They could say, we want this or this or this, or this is a good idea, this is not a good idea. So big discussions. And there was a referendum and 2/3 of the voters approved the proposal, but the referendum was not binding, it was consultative, and then the parliament just didn't pass it. So it's still kind of pending. Again, it's a very, very intricate, very, very interesting procedure, but came to an end and yeah, didn't work out at the end. Another example is South Africa, which had invited a broad public debate. There were radio talk shows, multiple channels for citizens to supply suggestions for the new constitution. There was a telephone line, there were online debate, and so on and so on. So different attempts to make sure that citizens could bring in their ideas, what should be in the new constitution. But most of these processes, as came already through, were more symbolic or of very limited impact. As I've said, like Chile or Iceland, there were some problems. And they were not really a far cry from the approach of self-governing I propose. Nevertheless, they are very interesting ideas, I think, which have been tried out. Yeah, and now I'm already at the end. I think we have to shift the perspective from representative democracy to self-governing democracy, which entails this idea to help developing new practice and procedures for self-governing, start with this participatory constitution building, and then continue with an ongoing process of self-governing because, as I said, societies change. And I think democracy has always to adapt to the new challenges that come up in a society. And if you want to learn more about the topic, this is the book, and it's also available on open access. Thank you very much for listening.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for the lecture. It was very interesting. I think this is what we can hope for, that there will be progress and that if we can will work together, we can help with this progress together. So thank you very much for this lecture. Thank you for taking the time for explaining it to us. And I'm sure if some of you have questions afterwards, they can contact you or they can contact us and we can send them the questions.
Yeah, my email address is on the web. You'll find it very easily. Go to university.
Yes.
So if you have a question, a comment, don't hesitate to write me. Thank you very much.